All right, folks, this is going to be just the 15-4, so should be relatively short. Let's get started. So let's look at the somatic sensory pathways. These are ascending pathways. Now, I want you to know the funiculi, the columns in which they travel, and I want you to know these pathways right here. But these pathways are broken up further, and I don't need you to go any further than what they're broken up. And I'll actually show you what exactly I want you to know. I can show you right here. I want you to know these three pathways. But the spinal thalamic pathway is divided further into the anterior and lateral spinal thalamic pathways. I don't need you to know the anterior and lateral spinal thalamic pathways, just the spinal thalamic in general. The posterior column pathway, it's also called the dorsal column medial lemniscus, is broken up into the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. And I don't need you to know those further subdivisions. I just need you to know the posterior column pathway. In the spinocerebellar pathway, just know the spinocerebellar pathway. All right, so these three pathways, all three of these are ascending pathways in the white matter of the spinal cord. And the green ones are the spinal thalamic pathways. You can see them there. These ascend into the central nervous, they already are in the central nervous system. They ascend into the brain. You can see the dorsal column medial lemniscus, also known as the posterior column pathway, right here and here. All of this. And then you can see the spinal cerebellar pathways here. So those are the three pathways you need to know. The biggest thing I want you to know is that the spinal thalamic pathway carries pain as well as other things like pressure and touch. It carries those things as well, but it carries pain. And the posterior column pathway doesn't carry pain. No pain modality. No pain labeled line, I should say. The modality is the type of receptor, and the labeled line is its pathway. No pain labeled line. All right. Now that's going to become important later. So I'm going to come back to that. But I need you to know the spinal thalamic pathway carries pain as well as touch and pressure, etc. And I need you to know that the posterior column pathway does touch and pressure, but no pain. So the posterior column pathway doesn't carry any pain. The spinocerebellar pathway carries a lot of proprioception. Now, I'm not saying that the other ones don't carry any, but this one carries a lot of proprioception because your cerebellum needs to know where all parts of your body are at all times. That's how your cerebellum executes its comparator function. So that's proprioception. Notice that they're named by, well, they're almost named by where they go. There's an older name for this pathway called the dorsal column medial lemniscus. Whoops, I can't spell. Dorsal column medial lemniscus. Now they just call it the posterior column because it's in the posterior column. We'll come back to that. I like the old name better, and you'll see why. Notice the spinal thalamic pathway talks about where it starts and where it goes. Starts in the spine, goes to the thalamus. Notice the spinocerebellar pathway is named by where it starts and where it goes. Starts in the spine and goes to the cerebellum. Spine thalamus, spine cerebellum. Okay, let's move on with these. I want you to remember that, the spinocerebellar pathways go to the cerebellum. That's where they go. There's the cerebellum right there. The rest of the somatosenses go to this postcentral gyrus right here. Remember, the postcentral gyrus is your primary somatosensory area. Somatosensory. Now, that's if it gets there. Remember that 90% of all sensory input goes to the thalamus. All right, 90%. And the thalamus takes all of its sensory input and only sends about 1% to the cerebral cortex. So only 1% of the thalamic input goes there. But that's where it goes, postcentral gyrus. And just to recall that the precentral gyrus is your primary motor area. And we'll talk about that when we get to the descending pathways. Okay. This is a spinal thalamic pathway. A couple ways you can tell. One is that it decussates immediately after synapsing, and you'll see how the dorsal column medial lemniscus does not do that. There's 3 neurons in here. By the way, there's more than 3 neurons in here. There's interneurons all over the place, but there's three main neurons in this labeled line. There's the first order neuron right here, the red one, first order. There's the second order neuron right here, that's the white one. And there's the third order neuron right here, and that's the black one, third order. So I have 3 neurons, first order, second order, and third order neurons. The first order neuron comes in, synapses in the gray matter right here. That second order neuron immediately decussates across the gray commissure and then enters its funiculus, its column. In this case, this is the anterior spinal thalamic tract. There also is a lateral one right there. This one happens to be the anterior. So it decussates and enters its funiculus and travels up through to the thalamus. Synapses in the thalamus, and then the third order neuron goes to the cerebral cortex. Maybe. Remember, only 1% of the time does it go to the cerebral cortex. So this is the spinal thalamic. This is the spinal thalamic pathway carrying the spinal thalamic fasciculi. First order, second order, and third order neurons. Okay. This is the lateral spinal thalamic. You can see there's a division of labor. You can see that the anterior spinal thalamic tracts do a lot of the touch and pressure. The lateral spinal thalamic tracts do the pain and temperature. Where is it? Right here, pain and temperature. So I told you before that the spinal thalamic pathways do pain and the dorsal column medial meniscus does not. And that's true. More precisely, the lateral spinal thalamic tracts carry your pain. And your anterior spinal thalamic tracts carry your pressure and touch. And again, you have your first order neuron, your second order neuron, and your third order neuron, just like before. Again, you decussate after you synapse in the spinal cord, you decussate. All right. So when you're burning your left hand, you perceive it in your right brain because you decussate. Sensory pathways and referred pain. This is called referred pain. This is what this is. What happens is, well, let's just go step by step. If you have pain in your liver or gallbladder right there, it might feel like you have pain in the skin of your shoulder, of your right shoulder. Now, here's what's happening. The sensory input in the lateral spinal thalamic tracts of your right shoulder converge with and travel with the pain tracts coming from the visceral receptors of your liver and gallbladder. All right. So the visceral receptors fire from your liver or gallbladder, and they enter your spinal cord. They synapse in your spinal cord and decussate, and they travel up through your lateral spinal thalamic tracts. All right. And then the sensory input from your right shoulder join it. So there's times when your brain can't tell the difference where the pain's coming from, and this is called referred pain. And all of these areas are referred pain. When the pain's in your heart right here, it might feel like it's in your left arm, up and down your left arm, and that's a common one that everyone knows. When the pain's in your ureters, you might feel flank pain and testicular pain because the pain tracts from your scrotum and your testes and your flanks join with the tracts running up from your ureters. When you have pain in say your stomach, it could feel like any of these abdominal pelvic areas. Or when you have pain in your colon, it could feel like any of these abdominal pelvic areas here. So this is referred pain, and it's because of how the lateral spinal thalamic tracts, how different areas of the body converge on that lateral spinal thalamic tract. What happens is this information gets your cerebral cortex, all right, and your cerebral cortex projects where that pain's coming from. And it doesn't always know exactly or precisely. And the reason why it doesn't always know exactly or precisely, because these lateral spinal thalamic tracts are traveling in the same funiculus, and your brain is projecting it to the wrong area. In addition, well, that's it. I'll leave it at that. All right, the posterior column pathway, also known as the dorsal column medial lemniscus, and that's how I learned it, so I usually say it that way. All right, dorsal column medial lemniscus. All right, here's what happens. This first order neuron enters this spinal cord and does not decussate and then travels upward. It ascends. It ascends all the way to the brainstem, to the medulla oblongata. It doesn't synapse until it hits the medulla oblongata. So this could be coming from your toe. And this neuron's coming from your toe, goes up through, enters the spinal cord, comes up through, and when it gets to your medulla oblongata, it then synapses with the second order neuron, and there's the second order neuron. The second order neuron still decussates, but it doesn't decussate in the spinal cord, it decussates in the medulla oblongata. That's where it decussates. Now, the nuclei of the medulla oblongata, where this synapses, is called the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. So these tracts, these fasciculi inside the dorsal column medial lemniscus, is called the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus because it's going to the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. That's why these fasciculi are called fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, because they're going to the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. Then when the second order neuron decussates, it travels in the medial lemniscus pathway right up to the thalamus. That's why this used to be called the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, because it wasn't just the dorsal column of the spinal cord it traveled through, but after decussation, it would travel in the medial lemniscus pathway up to the thalamus. After the thalamus, you have your third order neuron, and that gets sent to the cerebral cortex. So that's the dorsal column medial lemniscus. Now look at it does touch and pressure, just like your spinal thalamic. It does proprioception, just like your spinocerebellar. Notice there is no pain modality in these labeled lines. No pain modality. Now, why do I keep bringing that up? We think that the science behind acupressure and acupuncture is this gate theory of pain. A lot of data supports this. And what happens is, if you send a lot of signals up this dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, and meanwhile, in this lateral spinal thalamic pathway, you have pain information coming up through. Well, they all converge. They all converge at the thalamus, right? Well, the more information you send up the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, the less information that can come from the lateral spinal thalamic pathway. In other words, you can override the pain by increasing the dorsal column medial lemniscus input. Well, what does the dorsal column medial lemniscus do? Pressure, acupressure. Touch, acupuncture. So you can see that this might be the explanation for this acupressure and acupuncture. This gate theory of pain that says if you really overwhelm the thalamus with the dorsal column medial lemniscus input, you will lessen the input from the lateral spinal thalamic pathway and therefore lessen your pain. So that's why I keep bringing that back up. All right, spinocerebellar pathways. You're getting used to this, I'm sure. One very unique thing is look at right here. This one decussated. This one didn't. Sometimes oftentimes, in fact, these spinocerebellar pathways don't decussate, and oftentimes they do. Sometimes they decussate twice. So if I were to say to you, Spinocerebellar pathways are known to decussate, and spinocerebellar pathways are known to not decussate. Some of them decussate and some of them don't. And then I said this to you. There's a spinocerebellar pathway that decussates, but it hits the ipsilateral cerebellum. Remember, the cerebellum has hemispheres just like the cerebrum. So if I said that it decussates, and I said that it hits the ipsilateral cerebellum, how can both be true? Because what you think at first blush is that if you decussate, you hit the contralateral hemisphere of the cerebellum. That's what you think. Well, the answer must be, okay, if it is true that it decussates, and it is true that it hits the ipsilateral cerebellum, then it must have decussated twice. And that's the answer. Sometimes these guys decussate twice. The important thing here is this. The cerebellum gets a lot of proprioception from all parts of your body. It knows where all parts of your body are at all given times. Well, all parts of your body that actually have proprioceptors. And the right cerebellum gets information from the right and the left. And the left cerebellum gets information from the right and from the left. So both hemispheres of the cerebellum get information from both sides of the body. And this is what makes the cerebellum extremely good at balance and coordination. And let me remind you one other thing. A typical cerebral cortical neuron will have anywhere from, say, 2,500 to 25,000 synapses per neuron. But the cerebellar neurons, like the Purkinje cells, will have 250,000 synapses per neuron. Tenfold more than the highest of the cerebral cortex. Tenfold more, 100-fold more than one of the lowest of the cerebral cortex. So these cells in the cerebellum these neurons in the cerebellum have lots and lots of synapses, 250,000 on average per neuron, and they're getting information from both sides of the body. All right. Let me remind you just one last time that the sensory information is going to the postcentral gyrus and to the cerebellum. All right. Now that's what I was supposed to tell you right here. I'm sorry. I didn't know the picture was coming next. The amount of postcentral gyrus information dedicated to different parts of the body is not proportional to the size of your body. All right. For example, a whole bunch of brain matter is dedicated to your head. A lot of it. A lot of your brain matter is dedicated to your hands. If you were to draw the human body based on how much of the sensory postcentral gyrus is dedicated to it, here's what you'd get. You'd get huge hands. All right. You'd get huge facial structures, especially the lips, because your lips have a ton of sensory fibers in it. And this is why kissing is so pleasurable to most people, is because the lips have just a ton of sensory receptors in it. And you'd have relatively large genitals because you got a ton of sensory fibers in your genitals. And that's one of the reasons why intercourse is so pleasurable, because your genitals have a lot of sensory fibers in them. If you had no sensory fibers there, it wouldn't be pleasurable, and we'd probably go extinct. This is called the homunculus, man. I hope I spelled it right. Homunculus, man. In the rest of your body, the part of your body that actually is the bigger part of your body, I mean literally, your thorax and your legs, that's bigger parts of your body, literally, they would be drawn smaller. I mean, realize that right here, one hand is bigger than the rest of my body. And that's not how we actually look, so why would we draw us like this? Because the rest of our body doesn't have that much sensory input. But our hands and our face and our genitals have a ton of sensory input. And this is called the homunculus, man. Now, by the way, this is the sensory homunculus. When we draw a motor homunculus, he looks the same. He or she looks the same. That means that there's a lot of motor output to the head. There's a lot of motor output to the hands. That's why our fingers are so good at fine motor units, because our motor units are fine motor movements, because our motor units are so small in our hands. Meaning, you have to remember this from 203. I hope I didn't confuse you. When a motor unit is small, that means that the smallest a motor unit can be is 1 neuron, 1 myofiber. 1 neuron per 1 myofiber. That's the smallest a motor unit can be. But that gives us a lot of fine motor control. The motor units of our quadriceps would be 1 neuron, 10,000 myofibers. And what that means is 10,000 myofibers contract together, all or none. Well, that kind of takes away our fine motor control. So you can see that the motor units in our face and our hands are small motor units. We have lots of motor neurons going to those muscles in our face and our hands. So the motor homunculus just looks just like the sensory homunculus. This is a summary of your tracks. Just remember, the spinal thalamic tracts carry pain. All right. The dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway does not carry pain. Now there's overlap. Both the spinal thalamic does touch, and the dorsal column medial lemniscus does touch and pressure, and there's overlap here, but their pain is not one of the overlaps. All right. So these are good summary charts for you. The spinocerebellar pathways, they go to the cerebellum. Some of them decussate and some of them don't. And of course, they carry proprioception, because your cerebellum has to know where all parts of your body are at all times. All right.